I suck at 3D modeling. Well, actually, I used to suck before I spent 50 hours learning, practicing, and improving with Blender. Over the 50 hours, I learned a ton about hard surface modeling, and by watching this video, you're also learning 50 hours worth of material, but in like 20 minutes, and for free. That sounds like a sweet deal to me. For the first hour, I watched a bunch of YouTube videos just to refamiliarize myself with Blender. Now, that and refamiliarize implies that I already know Blender, which is true, but I'm super rusty and I've never been very good at 3D modeling in the first place. 90% of the time I've worked with Blender in the past has been sculpting, which is a completely different workflow, used for making more organic looking things, like creepy statues and ogres. So I'm not a complete noob, but I'm still definitely a noob. Here's pretty much the extent of my knowledge. All 3D objects are made up of little points called vertices, and you can move these vertices around individually or together with an edge or a face. You can also scale and rotate these edges and faces and the whole object. You can make a face within a face with inset, pull a face out with extrude, and also make edges smooth with a bevel. To add edges to your model, you can make a loop cut. There are also these things called modifiers, which you can mirror your object, make copies of them and put them in a row, turn a cube into a ball, cut holes, and so much more. My current relationship with 3D modeling is kinda like my relationship with chess. I know how all the pieces move, but I don't really know how to play. If you are completely new to Blender, after this video, make a donut. That's how I learned the absolute basics years ago, and that's how most people go about learning it. The Blender Guru YouTube channel has 3 full playlists on making donuts, which are great. Towards the end of the hour, I stumbled on a course that was advertised as a free beginner hard surface modeling course. So that's where I'm starting. Which was a big mistake. Even though I already knew the basics of Blender, I found it very difficult to follow along. I would watch the instructor edit something, pause and copy it in my Blender, and then go back and play. I gave up on it before finishing. It eventually is supposed to look like this, but I felt like I was wasting time. I can't deny though, what I have is really good. So if you're less interested in learning exactly what you're doing, and more interested in just making something that looks cool, this course is a good option for you. I'll have a link to this course, along with links to every other video and resource I used for the challenge, in a Google Doc linked in the description. Feeling slightly unmotivated, I went back to YouTube to try my luck with tutorials there. I found one on making a little coffee cup robot and followed along with that. This one was nice because the instructor took the time to explain what he was doing, and it also wasn't the most complex thing in the world to start out with. After the modeling, there was a little bit of work with materials and rendering. That stuff I'll talk about later too, but the gist of it is turning ugly gray shapes into cool looking pictures. The last project really boosted my confidence, and I'm at the point now where I'm pretty comfortable with the basics. I have this stylus thing that I want to try to create by myself. It's a tangible item that I have in front of me to reference at any point, and it's essentially just a glorified cylinder, so it shouldn't be too hard to model. I was struggling a lot with the angled cuts at the back part of the stylus, but I think it turned out really nice at the end. After the modeling was done, I made different materials for the different parts. This is just making the back part look a little bit smoother, and the metal parts look more like metal. Finally, I rendered the image, which is just converting the 3D scene into a 2D image, with very accurate ray-traced lighting. I had a lot of fun making the stylus, and wanted to do it again, but with an object that's just a little bit more complicated. I chose to model this little accessory to an Xbox controller. This one had some tricky angled curved surfaces, which were giving me trouble. To make the button icons, I used the knife tool and cut out what the icon should look like, and then extruded it out. That's how I made the controller icon at least. The other ones were separate shapes. Then I whipped up some materials and rendered out the image. I was so happy with the way this one came out, I posted it on Instagram. And if you're interested in seeing some more behind the scenes stuff, like unedited time lapses, I'll be posting those there in the weeks to come. The only thing I'm not super happy with so far is the time it's taking me to make this stuff. It has taken me 5 hours total to make these 2 little objects. So I'm gonna spend this hour trying to make things fast. I chose 3 items: a thumbtack, a portable power bank, and an electric pencil sharpener, and then spent the hour trying to model and render all of them. After the first 20 minutes, I finished the thumbtack. This one was very easy, but I wish I rushed through it a little bit faster. Next, I made the power bank. This one was a bit trickier due to the holes for the USBs, but I wouldn't say it was particularly difficult. I definitely took too long with it though, because I only had 14 minutes to make the hardest model. Things were looking grim, but I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and made the best looking pencil sharpener ever made. Then I made the most realistic looking materials too to make the render indistinguishable from real life. I decided to make this hour a research hour, where I learned all about bevels. Bevels are used to make sharp edges curved. You can bevel stuff in Blender in two ways: pressing Ctrl B on an edge, or using the bevel modifier. The modifier is nice because it's non-destructive, meaning you can edit the beveled edge as a single edge, but the downside is it's hard to bevel only a select few edges, and that's what the Ctrl B bevel is for. So far, everything I've made has been something tangible that I physically have in front of me to reference. When I'm making something for a game, that usually won't be the case. And because I do game dev, that's kind of the whole point of me trying to get better at 3D modeling in the first place. The plan is simple: spend the next couple hours making some models that fit together by being sci-fi alien technology. And I'm gonna start by making an alien gun. 40 minutes later. So, change of plans. I don't really like how this gun is coming along, and I've made some pretty bad choices with the modeling, leading to lots of shading errors. So, I'm partially scrapping the idea. I still want to model from my brain, but I think I should start a bit easier. Oh, I know. I'm gonna make a box. Done. No, silly. Not like a cube box, but like a box you put stuff in. Now, before you see the final thing, remember that I only had 20 minutes left in the hour, and this was all from my head, but here it is. It's pretty bad. It's clear to me that I need to work on getting some sort of reference when I'm modeling, because the difference between this and this is crazy. So that's what I started researching for this hour. Modeling without referencing. I couldn't find much on the topic though, only stuff on using reference images, not making them in the first place. Granted, I didn't research for too long because I felt like I was wasting time. I think drawing your own reference images is just a given, but I am very bad at drawing, so I really just don't know what to do. In one of the earlier tutorials, I heard the phrase 3-point lighting, but I don't know much about it, so I decided to spend the rest of the hour watching some videos on lighting. The gist of it is that you have one light called the key light, which is up and at a diagonal. This light will cast shadows, so you need a less powerful light called the fill light to shine on those shadows, and then a very powerful light behind the object called the rim light to make the shape of the object more pronounced. Now, I'm kind of at a weird spot in this challenge. Hour 16 was over a month ago. If you must know, I was busy doing Ludum Dare, working, winning a Canadian parkour competition, working on a top secret project, which I may or may not make a video about in the future if it becomes untop secreted, and just being lazy. But it doesn't matter what I've been up to, because I'm back for good now. Before the break, I worked on learning vanilla Blender, meaning it's free and it's what you get when you install Blender. Now I want to start working with some add-ons. The two main ones I'm going to start learning are Hardops and Boxcutter. I actually bought these two a while ago when working on my 3D puzzle game. You see, I thought they would be very easy and intuitive and instantly make me good at modeling. But actually, they have a bit of a learning curve and help you out once you learn how to use them. And I never ended up learning how to use them. $30 down the drain. Until now, at least. The two add-ons work very well together, but I'm going to start out by learning Boxcutter. Boxcutter is great for a Boolean workflow. That just means modeling with objects that cut into other objects. If I want to make a round hole in this cube, I could go crazy and try to make a perfect circle with the knife tool and then extrude inwards, or I can add a cylinder and use the Boolean modifier. Boxcutter gives you a little gizmo to show you exactly where your cutter will be and let you conveniently change it too. So I watched some videos explaining everything Boxcutter does. Then I followed along with a tutorial on making a sci-fi gun using Boxcutter. With the epic fail of the alien gun from hour 15 still looming over me, this was a nice little win, even though I was following the tutorial very closely. The same guy also had a tutorial on making a belt buckle, and I really liked that sci-fi gun tutorial, so I followed along with the belt buckle too. After those two models, I feel like I actually start to get Boxcutter now. And I'll admit that I think the Boolean workflow seems pretty messy at times, and I'm not sure I love it, but it definitely has its uses. Now it's time to learn about that other add-on I have, Hardops. How do I put this? Hardops is a lot less sexy than Boxcutter. With Boxcutter, you get that fancy gizmo to do cool stuff with your models. And with Hardops, you just have a bunch of convenient and useful features all together in one spot. However, overall in the remainder of the challenge, I've actually found hard ops to be the more useful one out of the two. The astute among you may have just noticed something. Last section was hour 22, and this section is hours 22 and 23. Now, it's definitely because I started this section's project right at the end of last section, and not because I'm stupid and wrote down hour 22 2 times in my log or anything like that. So stop asking. Well, anyways, I wanted to go back to how it was at the start of the challenge, and just make some models that are right in front of me, this time using hard ops and Boxcutter. For this section, I chose to model my USB flash drive. I was struggling a bit when working out the back section of it, but overall I think the model turned out really nice. Again, it just goes to show how night and day the difference is when I have the thing I'm modeling right in front of me. Using booleans with hard ops and Boxcutter is great for the most part. However, a consequence of booleans in general is messy topology and an unnecessarily large poly count. Modern game engines have been getting a lot better with poly count, but it's still a good idea to retopologize the mesh. That big fancy word just means remove some edges and vertices that aren't super important. With the sculpting workflow, this step is pretty much mandatory, but with meshes that aren't hundreds of thousands of tries, it isn't as necessary. I watched a few videos on the topic and then tried to retopologize the flash drive. For something like that though, there isn't much you can do, because deleting edges on a curved surface will take away from the curvature. To work on retopology, I need some more models. The plan now is to make 5 or 6 models that will be like set dressing for a game set on a colony spaceship. After I make a model, I'll retopologize it. And you know what? We're gonna play a game. The first model is a table, and I'll show you 2 pictures. One is the high poly, and one is the low poly. You'll have 3 seconds to guess which one's which. Ready? Go! Stop! If you thought this one was the low poly, you'd be correct. The main way you can tell is by the shape of the circle, and how it looks more like a polygon than a circle. Now, to be fair, the high poly still isn't a circle, it's just a more detailed polygon. The next model is the chair, and this time, you're only getting 2 seconds. Ready? Go! Stop! If you thought this one was the high poly one, then boy were you wrong. You can tell by the sharp edge that this one is the low poly because it doesn't have that nice bevel. The model for the final round is a shelf. 1 second on the clock. Ready? Go! Stop! Now if you thought this one was the low poly, good try, but you're wrong. This one was a tricky one, but you should have looked for those beveled edges again, but on the inside of the front face. I made 3 other models and retopologies during this section too. A clipboard, a better box to make up for the terrible one in hour 15, and a sci-fi water filler upper MacGuffin. Just like how retopologizing is a step that is only really showing its importance now that we're thinking about game assets, there's another step for us to take: UV unwrapping. UV unwrapping is all about cutting up your mesh so you can put 2D textures on the 3D model. It's kind of like wrapping a gift, where you have 2D wrapping paper going on a 3D object, but instead of wrapping, you're unwrapping by making very precise cuts. Here in the time-lapse, the panel on the left shows the UVs of the object, and the right side shows the 3D object where I'm putting the seams. The goal of UV unwrapping is to minimize distortion, with as few noticeable seams as possible. When finished, the color grid should look something like this. UV unwrapping doesn't take too long either. I was able to learn it and unwrap all 6 models in that 2-hour period, which was great. There is a way to have Blender UV unwrap for you by doing what's called a Smart UV project, but that way is generally worse. I have to say, I really like UV unwrapping, and it's probably my favorite part of the whole process. Ooh, what's this video?
Some people get excited about lighting, rendering, and other people get excited about UV unwrapping. And those people are psychopaths.
Well, now that we have our objects UV unwrapped, we can start making the materials. But before we do that, I'm going to do something a little cheeky. You see how we have a nice smooth bevel with the high poly table mesh, and you see how we have that hard edge on the low poly mesh that would go into the game engine? Well, we can use the bevel on the high poly mesh to fake a bevel on the low poly mesh for no additional geometry by baking out a normal map. Baking and normal map are 2 new words, so let's break them down. Normal maps are textures that are used to fake detail that isn't actually there. To apply a normal map, we plug the texture into a normal map node and then into the normal section of the materials shader. To create this magical normal map thing, we need to bake the normals. Baking is a process of putting some aspect of a 3D model, like color or normals in this case, on a 2D texture. For example, we could bake the direction of the faces of the high poly mesh, particularly around the bevels, into a normal map, and then apply this normal map to the material with the low poly mesh. Now, if that sounds confusing, don't worry, because it is. My first attempt at baking the normal map didn't go too well. The sides ended up looking super pixelated and jagged. I learned about the bevel node and tried using that, but it was more of the same issues. And then, just for ha-has, I made the texture 8K, so greatly increasing the texture resolution, which helped out a lot. However, an 8K texture is way too big for games, especially for something like a table. The issue, I believe, came down to not doing a good job modeling, which cascaded down to a bad retopology and then a bad unwrap. Let's just forget the table never happened and move on to something a little bit simpler, like a clipboard that totally belongs on a spaceship. This time I was able to bake the normal map super easy. I didn't change anything about the process, which just increases my suspicion of the table being a bad unwrap. Now it's time to make the material for this clipboard. Materials in Blender look like this. You place nodes and then plug them into other nodes that eventually get plugged into the inputs for the principled BSDF shader. It looks pretty confusing, but there's really 4 inputs that you want to focus on. The first is base color, which is sometimes called diffuse or albedo, and it's, well, the base color. Pretty self-explanatory. Next is the metallic, which is typically a 1 or a 0, designating if the object is metal or not. Roughness is typically somewhere between 0 and 1, and determines how much light gets reflected versus absorbed. Finally, the normal, which we already talked about with the normal maps. There are 2 really good videos in that Google Doc on how to make good materials, and after using the tips discussed in them, I made a nice looking clipboard material. You see all this mess that gives us a nice material? Well, Unity and Unreal would not understand this, because they don't speak Blender. Blender understands it, because Blender speaks Blender. What we need to do is bake out the color, metallic, roughness, and normals, each to their own texture, and then give those textures to Unity or Unreal. This is very similar to what we did earlier with baking, except instead of stealing info from another object, we're kinda just copying what's already on the material. This is the only reason we need to UV unwrap. I didn't bother before because we never had to bake textures. So I baked textures and everything appeared to be perfect. Well, we aren't done yet. I just noticed some darker splotches around the corners of the clipboard, and I think Blender may have just baked it for too long, causing it to burn. But it's not funny, because I have no clue what's causing them. After an hour of trying various potential solutions, I remembered the first thing you should do if you're having trouble with technology. Turn it off, and turn it back on again. And believe it or not, it actually worked. I don't know what the problem is, and I don't know if I should be mad or relieved, but regardless, I'm gonna move on. The last thing I did with the clipboard was export it, along with the textures, into Unreal to see how it looks. Unreal is very straightforward, but with Unity, there are a little bit more hoops you need to jump through, which we'll talk about later. Now that the clipboard was working well, I did pretty much the exact same thing with the chair. Nothing went wrong when baking out the normal map, I had lots of fun making the material, baking all the other textures was a breeze, and then I brought it into Unreal to see it in all of its glory. So, yeah, I guess there were 2 hour 38s too. But whatever, I got a shelf to texture. Once I finished up the material and baked out the textures, I took the shelf into Unreal. This was very easy, because all I had to do was hook up the 4 textures to the appropriate material pin inside the material editor. Unity is a bit trickier for 2 reasons. First, Unity is a little wacky and doesn't believe in roughness. Instead, it believes in smoothness. Let me explain. Roughness is a value from 0 to 1. With 1 being a very rough surface. Smoothness is the opposite, with 1 being completely smooth. So to make a smoothness map from a roughness map, you just have to invert it. The next reason is that there is no slot to put your smoothness map in the first place. If you want a material that has different smoothness values at different spots, you need to turn the metallic map's alpha channel into the smoothness map. I did that in GIMP and then exported the texture into Unity and then hooked everything up there. Now, you can also do this in a much easier way with shader graph, but if you don't know shader graph, this is how it's gonna have to be. The last thing I did with the shelf is render out 2 images. one for the actual material and the other with the baked textures. And somebody better get that texture a band-aid, cause she be bleeding. But in all seriousness, to fix this bleeding, we would have to increase the distance between the UV islands a bit more, or decrease the margin. But frankly, I couldn't be bothered to rebake everything. For the last 10 hours of the challenge, I want to focus less on learning new stuff and more on just having fun and practicing making models. A Pictionary word generator told me to make a desk, so that's what I would be making for this section. The modeling process went pretty smoothly. The only real thing of note here is that the handles are separate meshes that I joined with the main one, which I think is the first time I've done that with this challenge. I didn't bother with a huge retopology because I felt like I went a bit crazy with some of the previous items, and then I UV unwrapped it pretty fast. Afterwards, I went on to making the material. This part was a lot of fun. I found a good video on YouTube about making a wood texture, which made the bottom portion of the desk look really nice. I technically made two materials, one for the desk and one for the handles. This means I would have to bake both materials onto the same texture, which isn't as difficult as it sounds, but just a bit tedious. I didn't bother bringing it into a game engine, opting instead to just render it out. The bake turned out really well, because between these two renders, I feel like it's pretty tricky to figure out which one is the actual material and which one has the baked textures. Can you tell? Well, I don't blame you for getting it wrong, but this one is the bake. I'm very happy with the way this one turned out. If you had told me at the start of the challenge I would be making something pretty easily that looked that good, I would not have believed you. After being on top of the world with the desk, I clicked generate once more and got baseball. Easy enough, it's just a ball after all. About 30 minutes later, and I have whatever this mess is. If you had told me at the start of the challenge that at hour 43 I wouldn't even be able to model a baseball, I wouldn't have believed you. I inevitably gave up on it and generated computer. And before you say, well, that's not a computer, that's actually a monitor. I know, I just felt like making a monitor instead. Now, I could have spent the next hour or two texturing the monitor, but I had a better idea. About a year ago, I tried making a sci-fi gun to shoot cameras for my 3D puzzle game, and failed miserably, resulting in a futuristic tablet. During hour 15, I tried making a sci-fi gun, and again, failed miserably. For hours 17 through 21, I successfully made a sci-fi gun, but it's pretty basic, and I was following along with a tutorial. So I thought there was no better way to end off the challenge than by making a sci-fi gun solo. I started this one with a sketch, and took some notes on what I wanted this thing to look like. The plan was to be purely hipfire, with handles on the top to grab, have a big octagonal base with cylinders extruding out the top, and have a bunch of small barrels that shoot lasers into a parabolic mirror that concentrate at one point. I would love to say the modeling went awesome, but it didn't. First, Blender crashed on me 3 separate times, which was a big time sink. I also couldn't figure out how to make the parabolic mirror. I tried a few things out at first, but eventually just made a circle and extruded it with the 1, 1, 3, 1, 5, 1, 7, 1 parabola graphing trick. I didn't bother retopologizing because I was worried I was going to run out of time, even though I technically went 2 hours past the deadline because of hours 22 and 38. I UV unwrapped it and then made the materials. Finally, I baked out the textures and the gun was complete. I am very happy with the way the final render came out. I chose to bake in a higher resolution, which makes me not even be able to tell which one is the bake and which one is the actual material. Here's one, and here's the other. Now, I know which is which because I have the image files named appropriately and I'm the one editing the video, but I'm not telling you. I want to sit back and enjoy all the arguments in the comment section about which one's which. With the laser gun complete, you might be wondering what I'm going to be working on for this final hour. And, well, I don't know if I can call this a laser gun without any actual lasers. I think you can see where this is going. I modeled the lasers as a bunch of cylinders. This was a bit tedious because there were a lot of them, and for some reason I forgot about the existence of radial arrays. I skipped retopology and UV unwrapping because I wouldn't be making this into a texture. After all, I'm only doing this for the final render. I made the material all by myself like a big boy without any sort of tutorial. Then, I hit render. While we're waiting, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something or felt inspired to learn 3D yourself. I covered a lot of stuff in this video, but there were a couple really important lessons that I didn't explain fully. If this video does well and you guys want it, I'd be down to do a little part 2, where I go more in depth on this stuff. But anyways, the render's done. Here's the laser gun in all its glory. I'm so happy I was able to make it look this nice. Here's another angle too. Don't forget, all the resources I used to learn this stuff is in the Google Doc in the description. I also did a very similar challenge to this one a few years ago, but with pixel art. so click here to watch it. And while you're at it, why not subscribe? Thanks again. See you soon.